Well, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be with you again. Thank you for lunch. I feel a bit sleepy, I'm going to be honest. You'll definitely be feeling sleepy by the end of this talk, I'm sure. We're going to look at some of the reasons that people give for not believing in God. And I don't mean that to be negative in any way, but quite interestingly, when I talk to people about what I believe, or sometimes I make the mistake of going online to see why people don't believe in, if we say, Christianity, these are the kind of things that sometimes I get asked or that people are asking online. And it's quite interesting, I think, sometimes say, okay, well, let's see what people are actually saying that may not be something about, well, does this verse tie in with this verse? It might be something a bit more broad or a bit more general. Let's have a look at some of the things that people are asking and see if we can answer them. Because if what we believe is true, then we should have the answer to these questions. And if we can answer them, well, that builds up our faith, which is a useful thing in itself. It also arms us with some answers in case we ever get asked them. And if anyone is watching this, maybe with some of these questions themselves, or not too sure, well, is there really a God and that kind of thing, hopefully it can build up their faith too. So there's probably about, if we've got time, maybe about 5 or 6, just very quick kind of questions that, again, these are not ones that I've said, right, I'm going to pick the easiest ones. These are ones that come up a lot. And we'll just go through them and see where we get up to. It's very interesting, I think. It's worth saying, starting off by saying this: no one has ever proved that God doesn't exist. Now, you would have thought that there's a lot of people who would like to prove that God doesn't exist, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who tried very hard to prove that God doesn't exist, but no one's ever proved that. And I think that's an interesting starting point, isn't it? Actually, there is no proof for the non-existence of God. Now, quite interestingly, the reply to this is often this, and this comes up a lot, particularly when you look in kind of question and answer sessions online. You can't prove the non-existence of something. Therefore, you can't prove the non-existence of God. So some atheists would say the reason that we haven't been able to prove that God doesn't exist is because you can't prove something doesn't exist if it never existed in the first place. How can you prove a nothingness? And it kind of, from that point of view, kind of makes sense, except actually it's wrong. Yes, you can. You can prove the non-existence of something, and quite easily. So, let's do it now. Do you have, okay, is there an elephant under this table? You've just proved the non-existence, I hope there isn't, by the way. You've just proved the non-existence of an elephant under the table. Do I have an arm growing out of my head? No, I don't. How? Well, I can feel it, you can see it. You just proved the non-existence of something. It's actually very easy to prove that things don't exist. And there's also things like self-defeating statements. So, for example, one-ended lines don't. One-ended lines don't exist. Square circles don't exist. Also, married bachelors don't exist. You can prove the non-existence of something. So, although that statement kind of makes sense, how can I prove something doesn't exist if it never existed in the first place? And it kind of makes sense. As soon as you dig into it, you say, it doesn't make sense at all. You can prove the non-existence of something. And yet it's interesting that despite repeated attempts, no one has ever been able to prove the non-existence of God. Makes you wonder why, doesn't it? Maybe there is a God. In fact, I was mentioning this to someone earlier, quite interesting, and this person will pop up again later. Richard Dawkins, who you may know, the world's most famous atheist, who's made millions out of trying to rubbish Christianity. He has actually admitted that God might exist. He actually, bizarrely, he was on TV, it was on a scale, he used a scale of, I think it was 0 to 7, don't know why, but he said, if 7 was, I was absolutely certain that God doesn't exist. He said, I'm a 6. So the world's leading atheist has said God might exist, because he hasn't been able to prove that God doesn't. And if you can't prove that God doesn't exist, you have to at least be able to admit that he might do. Now, one of the things I like doing with questions like this, and I was talking to some young people about this the other day, where I said, I don't mind you shining a very critical light on our beliefs. I think it's really important. I think it's good. God's got the answers, you know, that's absolutely fine. But can you make sure that you also shine the same level of criticality onto the alternative? So, if you're going to say, well, we're going to, if you like, test Christianity, make sure you say, I will also apply the same level of testing to, let's say, atheism. And I think that's only fair. And I think sometimes people don't do that. They kind of ask a lot of questions of kind of God and Jesus and the Bible without saying, well, what's the alternative? Now, let's do that. Let's say that atheism was kind of, well, let's look at the atheist viewpoint for a moment. The fact that no one can prove that God doesn't exist is a problem if you're an atheist. Because to be an atheist, you have to say, God definitely doesn't exist. Right, let me show you where this has gone to. So, I'll read this out. I appreciate it's a little bit small. Oh, hold on. I've got an alarm going off on my phone. I'll tell you what it's for. I'm going to stop it because it'll go on. It's to remind my daughter about her Sunday school lesson this afternoon. So there you go. My wife will do it, don't we? So this is from the Cambridge Dictionary, first off. It says an atheist, and you probably know this, an atheist is someone who does not believe in any god or gods. And from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. Now, you're probably aware of that. If you're an atheist, you say there isn't a God. But that's a problem because unless you can definitely say God doesn't exist, you're not actually an atheist. What are you? Anyone? Agnostic. Thank you. You're an agnostic. I think I've got that on here. There you go, an agnostic. Someone who does not know or believes that it's impossible to know if a God exists. So what we're saying is no one's proved that God doesn't exist. Therefore, everyone should at least be an agnostic. But people don't want to be agnostics. They want to be atheists, right? So that's a problem. So this is where it's kind of led atheism to, right? So this is from atheists.org, which is not my favourite website, I need to let you know. So they've had to say atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. A little bit confusing. So atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God. It's simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. And it carries on. To be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods. It's a lack of belief in gods. It's a bit confusing, isn't it? They're kind of saying, it's not I don't believe in God, I'm just saying I don't believe in God, kind of thing. But the problem is, people are so desperate to be atheists, but they can't be because they haven't proved God's non-existence. So they're having to actually redefine what atheism is to counter this. And this is really interesting. So this is from a philosophy website. There are now two forms of atheism. There you go. There's strong and weak atheism. So strong atheism is the doctrine that there is no God or gods. Weak atheism is the disbelief in or denial of the existence of God or gods. It's really confusing, isn't it? And what's happening is people are just trying to say, well, maybe they're running around in circles rather than just saying, maybe God exists. But rather than just admitting, maybe God exists, they would rather kind of redefine what atheism is again and again and again. So, in terms of, but going back to, you can't prove the non-existence of something, you can prove the non-existence of something, but no one has ever proved that God doesn't exist. So we should, or people should at the very least, be agnostic. Right. Now the next one, this could be a talk in its own right, but it comes up ever such a lot. Science has proved that God doesn't exist. It really should be, science has proved that God does exist. There's a brilliant book, by the way. If I thought I should have brought it with me. I've got 2 copies because I'm always lending one out to people. It's called In 6 Days. In 6 days, 50 of the world's leading scientists about why science has led them to a belief in God. Some of them started off as believers, but some of them started off as atheists, and the science led them to God. It's called In 6 Days, and these are the kind of people who have 2 PhDs in their own research laboratories and things like that. They're absolutely incredible, right? Science absolutely has proved that God does exist, but what people have done is they've turned this into a black and white fallacy, if you like. So the black and white fallacy, in fact, I think I've got that up here. Let's see. Yeah. So they've turned it into it. You either believe in science or religion. You can't believe in both. And that's what's called the black and white fallacy, where basically you separate an argument in saying, well, it's got to be this or this. So it's a little bit like this. This is a classic example of a black and white fallacy. It's like saying, if you love dogs, therefore you hate cats. That's not the way it is, right? So what they've done is said, well, you believe in religion or science, and you can absolutely believe in both because God created science, right? Now, let's just think about this for a moment. First off, I mean, personally, I believe that the earth is roughly 6,000 years old, or certainly since Adam and Eve were ejected from Eden. But let's say, for the sake of argument, the earth was 60 million years old or 60 billion years old. That doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It just means I might have to re-understand some of the verses. But in no way does that mean that God doesn't exist. Does it disprove God? No. The point is, though, as you go into science, you find all these things, and there's so many of them throughout the Bible, that absolutely prove that God exists. I'm going to give you one, and this is from that book, In 6 Days. By science's own standards, only God could create the universe. Right. Science has a rule that something becomes deemed statistically impossible when the odds of it happening are smaller than 1 times 10 to the negative 50. So to give you an example of what that is, so when the odds of something happening are smaller than 1 in 1 with 50 zeros after it, then it's deemed impossible. So a scientist would say, the odds are now so tiny, it cannot happen, right? So that's 1 times 1 in 1 with 50 zeros after it. The odds of life happening by chance, what are the odds of that? Well, I can simplify it. What are the odds of 1 single cell being formed by chance? I mean, obviously, there's, an almost infinite number of cells in the universe. But let's just say 1 cell of the human body. What are the odds of that happening by chance? It's this. So it's not 1 in 1 with 50 noughts. The odds of a single cell forming by chance is that. And I've got some more zeros. You've got to add all those zeros on as well. And you've got to add on all those zeros as well. I think there's a few more zeros there. So add all those zeros on as well. And are we there? I think no, not going to add those zeros on. There you go. That's 40,000 zeros. And I've already been asked, did you type them all out? 1, 2, 3, 4. No, I did 50 and then copy and paste and then. But what science says is once something becomes, once the odds of something happening are smaller than 1 in 1 with 50 noughts, scientifically it cannot happen, right, naturally. And yet just 1 cell, let alone cells in the right shape and the right form and all joining together in the right way, right, just 1 cell being formed by chance is 1 in 1 with 40,000 zeros after it. It cannot happen by chance. And by the way, that's a conservative estimate. I've seen some people who have suggested it might be 1 and then a 1 with 110,000 zeros after it. By science's own standards, life cannot have been formed by chance. It's impossible. What do we call it when something that is scientifically impossible happens? We call it a miracle. And that's what it is. And therefore, further evidence for the existence of God. This one comes up a lot. You can't trust the Bible as a historical document. I had someone at work say that to me. Well, you can't trust this, can you? You know, clearly it's just been written to persuade this and persuade that, and it's not historically accurate and things like that. And you may know that the person who's often referred to is this person, Alexander the Great. Yeah, interesting looking man. His horse looks a bit worried as well. But Alexander the Great. Now, we all know about Alexander the Great, or a little bit. He was around in the 4th century BC, roughly. And there are 5 main documents that record his life. So these are the 5 main documents that record the life of Alexander the Great. Diodorus, Curtius, Arrian, Plutarch and Justin. So from the 1st century BC, so what's that? That's about 200-300 years after Alexander the Great, up to Justin, who, well, if it's the 4th century, that's about, what, 700 years later, something like that. So we're certainly talking about people, most of the documents concerning Alexander the Great are written centuries, even kind of over half a millennia after Alexander the Great was alive. The really interesting thing is they're still considered to be valid, trustworthy historical sources. People still say, well, we know this about Alexander because, for example, Arrian wrote it 500 years after him. How can you trust that? But people do. In fact, now this is off Wikipedia, which might not be the world's most reliable source, but I found it quite interesting that listed on Wikipedia, it actually listed these writers as contemporary sources of Alexander. Well, some of them might be 700 years later. I'm sure that's not contemporary as far as I understand the word. Right, but what people are saying is, these people wrote about Alexander the Great centuries after him, and we're willing to accept that as the truth and as fact. Now let's have a look at, this is just the books of the New Testament, and rough dates. You know, obviously some of the dates are easier to pinpoint than others, but the rough dates, and we've got everything from, for example, Galatians at around 55 AD, James 50 AD, through to Revelation and the books of John, kind of into the 90s, 90 AD, 95 AD, that kind of thing. So most of these were written, most of them were written within 50 years of Jesus' life. And most of them were written by eyewitnesses. Obviously, many of them were written by Paul, and Paul was blinded, but we would say that he did actually meet Jesus. And obviously, Peter and John, and obviously Revelation written by John, and, you know, in front of Jesus and things like that. So these were written, most of them, within a few decades of Jesus' life by people who actually met him. Which do you consider more valid as a historical record? These, or the ones about Alexander the Great that were written 300, 400, 500 years later? It's interesting that people will accept the ones about Alexander the Great, but not accept the eyewitness accounts. Strange that, isn't it? So from a historical accuracy point of view, looking at just the New Testament there, it's certainly more valid as a historical record. I think one of the problems is that, of course, we have the Bible, as we understand it, but which is all these different books all put together in one. And so people see it as one book, and in many ways it should be seen like that. If we put the 5 writings about Alexander the Great together, you wouldn't say, well, I don't trust them now, because it's clearly written by disciples of Alexander who wanted to prove him correct, would you? Just putting them together doesn't reduce their validity. And I think that's what's happened with the Bible. But the Bible is absolutely a collection of valid historical documents by a number of writers, and if we look particularly at the New Testament, they are eyewitness accounts. Why would we not believe that, but we would believe the writings about Alexander? I've had a number of people say this to me. You see, yeah, faith. Faith is used as an excuse when you don't know something. Like, oh, well, if you don't know, you've just got to have faith. You know that kind of thing. Well, if you don't understand, yeah, you've just got to have faith. And which is a shame, because some people, I think, some elements of some denominations within Christianity do that. Oh, well, we don't understand this, so you've just got to have faith. You hear it a lot, for example, about the Trinity. It's a great mystery. You've just got to have faith, rather than saying, well, maybe it doesn't make sense, right? So, faith is used as an excuse when we don't have evidence for something. And I think the idea here is that some disciples of Christ don't understand things or don't have any evidence to support it. So they go, you just got to have faith to kind of fill in the gaps. I think we just need to be clear on something, and that is what faith is. Now, if I said to you, oh, could you think of a verse that defines what faith is? I'm guessing most of you are now in Hebrews 11 verse 1 in your mind, because that is the definition of faith. I'm going to bring it up, but this is from the Good News Bible, just because it's very, very clear, right? To have faith is to be sure of the things we hope for, to be certain of the things we cannot see. And I've highlighted the word see. This is really important. What it does not say is this. To have faith is to be sure of the things we hope for, to be certain of the things we cannot prove. The writer to the Hebrews didn't say, well, if you can't prove something, you've just got to have faith. He said, no, you can prove the existence of God. Faith is about believing what you can't see, and that's very different. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This could go horribly wrong. I was going to say, you can't see my brain, how do you know I've got one? You might question that. But you know what I mean? We can't see each other's brains. But we know that we all have brains because we can see the evidence for it by the fact that, we're alive and we're walking and talking and thinking and things like that. So there is evidence for what we cannot see. I won't play it now, but this is very interesting. So I mentioned Richard Dawkins earlier. So there's Richard Dawkins on the left, and he's debating with a Christian called John Lennox on the right. It's a huge lecture theatre. And Richard Dawkins makes this point, and he says, well, you see, you only use the word faith when you don't have any evidence for something. And John Lennox says that's not the case at all. He says to Richard Dawkins, he says, do you have faith in your wife? And he says, yes. He says, is there any evidence for that? He said, oh, yes, plenty. And the whole audience started laughing at Richard Dawkins, because he's just disproved his own argument. And yet he still holds to that point of view, sadly. It's a very, very interesting debate. Faith is not believing in something that can't be proved. It's believing in something that can't be seen. And there is plenty of evidence for God. Can you turn up Romans chapter 1, please? And, I mean, we could spend a lot of time just looking at the evidence for God. But I think God, the Apostle Paul sums up God's point of view so clearly in Romans chapter 1. And we'll just take a few verses. Let's start at verse 20, for example. So Romans chapter 1, verse 20. There you go. For his invisible attributes, this is talking about God, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So in other words, God has given you tons of evidence by the things that have been made through creation. So people are without excuse. For although they know God, they did not honour him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. It's very, very strong language. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So what the Apostle Paul is saying there is, It is absolutely clear that God exists. He has given us all the proof we need, and we just need to look at creation for a start. But people have decided to ignore that and go and effectively worship creation rather than worship God. But the proof is there, undoubtedly. And we may not be able to see God, but we have faith. We have faith because we can see what he has done. We can see what he is doing. We can see him at work. We can see him at work in the world, for example, what's happening in the world at the moment. We can see prophecies fulfilled and archaeology and all those things. Our faith is based on evidence. It's not some speculation. This is an interesting little question here. This comes up a lot in kind of online debates and things. We don't need God to tell us what's morally right and wrong. Why should God be the person who tells us what's right and wrong? I know what's right and wrong, and I don't need God to set the standards. Quite interesting, isn't it? Now, the first question, I was asked this, I was going to say not that long ago, it's probably about a year ago. The first point is actually quite an interesting one. Is to say this: without God, how do you know what's right and wrong? That's a bit of an unusual answer, isn't it? But rather than saying, okay, well, here's my answer, saying, well, okay, let's say you don't believe in God. How do you know what actually is right and wrong? And you could say, well, obviously I know, murder's wrong, for example, something like, being kind to people is right. Murder is wrong, that kind of thing. It's quite an interesting thing, this. Have a look at this. So Bertrand Russell, possibly the greatest philosopher of the last century, a confirmed atheist, although interestingly had some really nice things to say about the Christadelphians. He basically was very positive about the Christadelphian denomination, although he was an atheist. But I think he said something like, I've read it, I can't quite remember now, he said something like that he felt we were the closest as a denomination to what Christianity should be, or early Christianity or something, which is interesting. But again, this is from All About Philosophy website. It says, atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell declared, and philosophers generally agree, without God, there is no absolute truth and thus no universal moral standard of conduct. The exclusion of God necessitates moral relativism. Now, we'll come on to that in a moment. What they're saying is, if you don't have God, who is the final arbiter, the final judge of what is right and wrong? Well, there isn't one. So you get this thing called moral relativism. And this is an atheist point of view. Okay, and this is what moral relativism is. Moral relativism is the view that moral or ethical statements, which vary from person to person, are all equally valid, and no one's opinion of right and wrong is really better than any other. This results in the biggest practical problem for relativism. It is difficult, if not impossible, to condemn any actions from a stance of moral relativism. So what it's saying is, if you don't have God, so if you say, okay, you don't believe in God, who decides what is right and wrong? And the non-godly perspective, or the atheist perspective, is, well, then it's up to each individual, isn't it, what's right or wrong? Which means one person could say that murder is wrong, and another person could say that murder is right. And they're both right, because it's up to the individual. What a terrible mess we'll get ourselves into if basically everyone is right in their own eyes, which might remind you of a Bible verse. Everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. Now, this might seem like a bit of a stretch, saying that without God, there is no definitive right or wrong. I'll mention Richard Dawkins again, because he came out with quite an interesting statement, because he was asked about this, about, if God doesn't define right and wrong, what are the implications for that? He said this: what's to prevent us from saying Hitler wasn't right? I mean, that is a genuinely difficult question. I find that absolutely shocking. But from his point of view, if you follow that atheist viewpoint, what you're saying is, well, if we don't have a God, so we don't have a divine being who sets the standards of right and wrong, and therefore it's up to each person as an individual to decide what is right and wrong, then Hitler, in his eyes, was doing what was right, and I can't really condemn him. Isn't that absolutely terrible? It's not a difficult question for a true believer in God. I can tell you categorically what Hitler did was wrong and evil. It's simple, right? I would hope that, I'm sure we all agree on that. But the atheist viewpoint is, I can't necessarily say Hitler was wrong if I don't believe in God. And that's where it's kind of leading us to. Unbelievable. Right, we'll just do one more, which is this. Why God? Why should I believe in God? What about all the other gods like Thor, Zeus, Odin, all these people? You know, if you go back a couple of thousand years, when much of this was written, people believed in those gods, didn't they? So why should I not believe in one of them instead? Well, it's very simple. Firstly, this religion still exists. We won't read the passage now, but you probably know the passage I'm talking about. It's where Gamaliel, kind of very respected teacher of the law, said, if this new religion, Christianity, is from God, there's no point us opposing it. Because if it's from God, it will continue. We can't stop it. And 2,000 years later, it's still going. So that would be one piece of evidence where, apart from a relatively small number of people, I don't think anyone really believes in Thor or Odin, people like that anymore. Whereas obviously there are millions who still believe in God. Another thing that's quite interesting is the required nature of a God who can create the universe. God actually fits the pattern of what would be needed to create the universe. Powerful, sitting outside of space, sitting outside of time. So God actually fits in with, when you read about God, the type of being that is needed to create a universe. Thor, Zeus, and those people do not. And, of course, and this is really, really important, substantial evidence for the validity of the Bible record. We know about prophecies, some of which are unbelievably accurate. Prophecies, archaeology, the way the Bible, written over hundreds and hundreds of years, actually all fits and holds together. And so many other bits of evidence. I mentioned science, for example. So there is substantial evidence for the validity of the Bible record, but not for those other gods from a couple of thousand years ago. There isn't similar evidence to support Zeus, but there also isn't similar evidence to support Vishnu or Shiva or Brahma, for example, or the Islamic faith, Allah or Muhammad. There isn't the same level of evidence. So what we might call the Judeo-Christian God is the only answer. Right. I'm going to finish with this. How many of you have heard of the theory of Occam's razor? Anyone heard of Occam's razor? One. Good. This is why you do the announcements, you see, because you've got the intelligence of Occam's razor. So Occam's razor is a theory named after William of Ockham, who was this monk. No one's quite sure why it's called Occam's razor, whether he shaved a lot or something, but it's called Occam's razor. I'm just telling you that's what it's called. He was a monk many centuries ago, but he came out with this theory, and Occam's razor's theory. The theory of Occam's razor is this: pluralitas non est ponenda sine necessitate. And I'll leave you with that thought. Right, even with my Latin lessons as a teenager, I better explain. Plurality should not be posited without necessity. Let's put it even more simply. Effectively, you shouldn't overcomplicate something unless you really have to. And sometimes it's actually simplified even more, I think. The simplest argument is usually the correct one. Very interesting. The simplest argument is usually the correct one. God is the simplest and best argument. It doesn't overcomplicate. There is a God who created the world, who sent his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, who died for our sins and rose again and will return to set up the kingdom. We're not having to redefine Christianity in the way that atheism is trying to redefine itself and change what it means to fit in. We're not having to have different definitions of what right and wrong is, because we know it. It's very simple. There you go. It's there. God is the answer. It's the simplest and best argument, and he has the answer to every question. The ones we've looked at today and others. And the evidence is absolutely there. And based on that, we now have to have faith in him. Thank you.